Hey, so most videos on my channel they focus on list building and on practice games and on all kinds of stuff to prepare you for a tournament. And this video is also focused on tournament preparation, and it's focused on how to speed up your gameplay on tournaments, and also just for your games in general. Why might this be a good thing? Well, a lot of tournaments they actually have a time limit. You wouldn't think so, maybe, but in the normal tournament rules pack, it's described how long you have for any particular game, ranging from I think 2.5 hours to 3.5 hours, something along the lines of that. And yeah, it's important to be able to play your games within this time limit. So obviously, when you're at home and you're just trying out some stuff, or at your local game store, well, at your local game store you might be restricted by the opening times, but you can take as much time as you want generally. Whilst in a tournament setting, everybody has to finish the games more or less equally quickly, with an exception of the very quick players who can sometimes manage to finish the game within 10 or 20 minutes, just because everything goes bad on turn two. But there's definitely a couple of ways in which you can speed up your tournament play in case you are concerned about well, the pace at which you play. And the first thing starts with just army preparation. So thing one is that you can just build your army list accordingly. What do I mean by that? So there's a lot of different things you can include in armies, and you can obviously benefit from all of those if you combine them. But just to make it easy on yourself, you can also opt to just bring an army that's not really well, that doesn't demand any of your action in all the phases of the game. So there are some armies that are just restricted to this by design. So, for example, Warriors of the Dark Gods doesn't have any shooting, and it has fairly simple movement if you don't take a helm off. And well, demons also don't. They just have minimal amounts of shooting. A dwarven purely gun line doesn't have a lot of movement normally, and also not a lot of magic. Whereas if you play high elves, for example, with a spellcaster with an entire spellbook, and just a combination of some shooting with some chaff and some cavalry and all the different things that you can put in your army, then you're setting yourself up for a bit of a longer game probably. So yeah, there's this one aspect of list building where you can just limit yourself to these choices. And then the next thing is that you can also minimize the flexibility with the list as a whole. So yeah, there's like within the ETC format, there's a couple of descriptions for list. So you have the draw list that's just focused on playing into a draw, whilst being able to carry some points along the way. You also have rush lists, for example, that are just focused on pushing your opponent off the field just through sheer pressure. And yeah, depending on what kind of list that you build, you'll have more or less options to think about during your turn. So yeah, some examples of this are just an ogre list with 2 ogre blocks, 2 stone horns, and they just want to push the opponent off the table basically. So turn 1 you're going to be moving forward, turn 2 you're going to be charging, and if you're not charging in turn 2 then something went wrong. So yeah, that's kind of the gist of that. And you'll see that if you deviate from this plan, the list is gonna perform less well in most cases. So, well, in this video, I'm just gonna talk about the usual cases. So, of course, there's always exceptions, but just generally, you can design your list with a certain idea in mind, and well, you do specialize your list a little bit like that, so the matchups are going to be a bit you're going to be a bit more matchup dependent because you don't have all the answers to every single list that you might encounter. So if you don't mind that, then this is a good idea uh, to alter your list like that. And the last point that is incredibly important to speed up your games is to just know your army. Just know what every single unit does. Preferably build the army list that you built yourself, so that you know why that you included certain pieces. And if you have done so, then it's way more clear for yourself what you should do with your army, and also you will know the limitations of the units you have. So I think that is a good setup to just get you started into tournament play. But then again, there's also stuff that you can do during the tournament. So during the individual games, of course. So some preparation that you can do for this is that for your own turns, just bring sufficient dice, bring sufficient tokens and tools that you use on a regular basis to help you in your games. So yeah, examples of this include, well, you obviously have your dice. Make sure that you have some kind of wound markers also. So as you can see in the picture, I usually have just different dice in my dice pack, and some of them, the big white ones, I use as wound markers, and the smaller ones I just use to throw them. I have some of these weird Games Workshop magic dice. I use them for my field tokens, and then I have some extra dice in there just for objectives and keeping track of some points and stuff like that. And otherwise, you can see that I have some short measuring sticks. These are nice for just determining whether you're in musician range. I don't use these that often because usually the measuring tape is more convenient. I always bring 2 measuring tapes. So I often have in my games that I leave my measuring tape somewhere, and then my opponent also just has 1 measuring tape. So well, you know what measuring tape you have yourself. So it's, yeah, whenever you need one, there's always one of the 2 close by, I find. And then when I don't have anything to do in my turn, I always collect my measuring tapes again. But there's then always some close by, so you don't have to run around the entire table to get it. And otherwise, yeah, so you also see a quick reference page of the army that I'll be playing. This is also incredibly useful if you're a little uncertain about the stats of your units. And then, of course, the rulebook. Also to just look up some rules during your opponent's turn, possibly. Like if he is walking into a ruins with a unit and you're not sure on whether he has to take a dangerous terrain test or not because of the unit type, you can propose to just first move another unit and then look it up during the time that he is moving the other unit, and like that you're not wasting any valuable time, basically. And well, the last things you see are the magic cards. So for each deck I have also the magic cards, just for myself and also for my opponent's magic, so you can keep track of what your opponent might be doing, so you don't have to go like, yeah, what else magic do you have, and what is the other stuff, and what is the range on this one, or and that also just helps speed up your game. So that's in terms of well, equipment, basically. And then for your turn itself, it's quite important that, or well, it speeds up your game quite significantly if you know what you want to achieve at the end of your goal. So, well, often, just a good example is whenever I play against Vermin Swarm, I think I have the feeling that the Dreadmills and the Vermin Demon are very important. And my general time plan against Vermin Swarm, it's one of the few armies that I have this for, but like turn 1 and 2 are dedicated to the removal of the Dreadmills, because I can't touch the Vermin Demon anyway if my opponent is playing in a decent way with his demon. And then turn 3 and 4 is just weathering down on the Vermin Demon, following up on the first turns where I might have put some magic on it. And then turn 5 and 6 should be clean up of the enemy army. And yeah, any units that he brings towards me are going to be small units, like Plague Disciples. And there should be some units in your army that can handle it. Yeah, so some other examples are when you're playing against Bretonnia, you're going to know that the first turn for your opponent is going to be the setup turn, where he wants to set up some charges, or at least threaten to charge in. And then the Bretonnians, they generally only want to charge if they can also make sure that their Night Bus is not going to get countercharged after they break through your unit. So you can set up your army in a way that is not really possible, or you can move backwards a bit, or you can just very aggressively move one unit forward, so they have to either charge the unit or get charged next turn. And for each of your turns, you can basically predict quite well at some point what you think is going to be a good goal for the turn. So that might sound a little bit fake, but as long as you know what you want to achieve in your turn in general, it's gonna just immensely speed up your gameplay. Because then for each unit you can consider whether it's involved in the plan of your main goal or not. And then we get to the next point. So when you're facing some tough choices, continue somewhere else. So you have a plan that you want to do for your turn. For example, this turn I want to shoot the Griffin of my enemy, and I'm gonna need this amount of shooting troops to do so, more or less. And you should always just add a little bit extra, just to make sure that you have redundancy, in the sense that you are going to be able to achieve the goal that you want, if you're able to dedicate as many troops to it as you might want to. So what I'm basically saying here is that if you want to shoot down a Griffin of the enemy and you have 60 crossbowmen available, whilst 40 might do the trick, you can just go through the first, well, if you have 6 units of 10, you can go through the first 4 units of 10 and just align them, well, see if they are within line of sight of the Griffin. And then with the remaining 2 units you have, you are now free to do whatever you want in your but then again, for the 4 units you have already made up your mind, and well, you can do this for your entire army nearly. So in the end you'll only have a couple of units where you really have to make some tough choices. So naturally for me, whenever I'm playing most of my armies, I just start with the easy stuff, and then with the tough choices at the end, I can still decide what I do. So sometimes this is not really the best iteration of your tactics, but in most games it does the trick quite well. So it liberates up some thinking if you have a plan, and then you can also just see if you're going to manage it with the units that you want to achieve this plan with. So yeah, also small examples. So for example, you have some objective on the flank, and you have 3 units of infantry and you have 1 unit of knights, and the flank is not contested by your opponent. The first move here would probably be to just move your knights fully forward towards the objective, and get some objective points for that. And then by doing so, if you had started at the infantry and had thought like, well, what should I do with this infantry block? I have an objective to go to. Then the choice is still there, whilst if you just first do it with your cavalry, because your cavalry is going to be faster anyway, then it's gonna free up your mind a bit more to think about what you're gonna do with the infantry. Yeah. So and then the last thing that can speed up your own turns is to ask for confirmation by your opponent for some placements. So what I generally do is that whenever I'm measuring out some charge distances, I tell my opponent that I'm measuring out like 19-inch for him. So it's going to be a 19-inch charge for him. So if he has movement 7, it's a 12 on the dice. Then I place my unit. We have discussed it. My opponent is aware of it being a 12. So a second advantage that stems from this is that if some units get nudged about, you still agreed with your opponent that about some charge distances that are important to you. So I had it once at a tournament where I shot at a unit, and then my opponent removed the casualties, and then the unit was nudged a little bit, and then the next turn my opponent thought that he was actually in line of sight of a unit that he now could charge. But then I reminded him that during his turn we actually agreed, I showed him the angle, and we agreed that he couldn't see my unit. So in such scenarios it's really helpful to just confirm with your opponent certain placements. Also, sometimes you have these placements where both you and your opponent are fully convinced that it is possible to put down a unit in a specific way, just like outline of sight of this guy, and then within 8 inches of these guys, and well, whatever. But it's just gonna take like 5 to 10 minutes to completely figure out how exactly you have to do it. And sometimes I just leave an inch of movement and go like, yeah, I want this to be here. Do you agree that I can put this unit from here to that position, or do you want me to measure it out completely? And then if your opponent goes like, yeah, sure, then you could just save a lot of time on some stuff that is not really necessary. So that's for your own turn. But you can also be active in your opponent's turn to try to increase the game speed for the benefit of the both of you. So, well, one thing that you can actively do is to ask your opponent what his or her intention is with certain moves, so that it's just clear for the both of you. That, for example, he wants to stay with the front of his unit within ruins so that he gets cover, and he wants to be within 17 inches of another unit. You can either just fiddle around with the unit for 5 minutes until you get the perfect placement, or you agree that these two conditions have been met by putting a unit down in a certain way, or you can help him like, yeah, you have to tilt the unit a little bit more towards the left or the right in order to achieve that specific goal. And yeah, it's a little bit of a more tricky one than the stuff that you do in your own turn, because if you help your opponent in such a way, then you're a little bit riding a line between actually helping him and not making him aware of some other dangers that his units might run. So, for example, you could just be helping him just completely tear up his own army. So what I always try to do is just be as objective as possible with respect to my opponent's army, and just go like, yeah, you can see this, but not give any further judgment on it, neither positive or negative. And well, I never had any complaints of my opponents that I'm too involved in my opponent's turns. But maybe some opponents once or twice experienced that I'm a little bit too involved. I could imagine it. But it's all good for good intentions and good purposes. And it really also speeds up your game to just, well, to have him achieve what he wants to do. Yeah. So otherwise, you can just do some pre-planning for your own turn. So you can measure out some distances that are going to be important. Some opponents actually pay attention to what you do during their turn, but it's not that common, I find. And sometimes they also ask you, what are you checking? And then you can just say like, yeah, I'm just measuring the distance between these two units because I find it interesting. Also, you can do some mock measurements just to um, make your opponent believe that you're focused on something else, and have them look at the two units very quizzically, like, why is it important that the distance between my two units is 23 inches and not 24? um, and it's the game states that you are allowed to measure any distance at any given time, so it's not like you're doing something that's not allowed or anything. But it just helps myself sometimes, just for example, for the magic phase of my opponent. Like if he has Hellfire, for example, which is only 18 inches range, but it is 2d6 strength 6, so that's quite a big impact spell, unless you have a lot of armor. Then it's worthwhile for yourself to just first, whilst your opponent is just organizing his magic cards, his magic dice, and shuffling around fail tokens. It might be interesting to just measure out the 18 inches and see what units he can reach with that spell before he has to actually make the decision even of which unit to cast it on, because then you can already plan ahead of like, maybe you don't have any interesting targets for your opponent to cast Hellfire on, so you already know that once the dice have been thrown for Hellfire, you can just pass it on without dispelling it, because any of the units that you have might not be interesting to dispel it for. And then, yeah, the last thing is to just help your opponent measure stuff, look up stuff. As I said, like when your opponent is moving into a ruins, just and you're unsure about it, just propose that he continues somewhere else and just look up the rules for him, show it to him. And I'll always be open about this. So when your opponent asks you to clarify a rule, just look it up in the rulebook, show it in the rulebook to your opponent. And just be a nice guy, basically. And yeah, just being a nice guy actually speeds up your game also, I find. Yeah, so I would say that that's most of it. And yeah, with that, I actually managed to finish most of my games at tournaments. I think it's also related to having played Flames of War for some time. So Flames of War is also a tabletop war game, but it's a historical setting, so it's Second World War. But it's way more based on scenarios, and there's no turn limit. So if you're the attacker, you can basically you have to go through the defender's forces sometimes, but you can take as many turns as time permits. So that's a bit of a different concept. So in 9th Age, obviously, you only have 6 turns and that's it. With Flames of War, I once played a game where we did more than 18 turns. So, yeah. And neither of us thought it was a very fast-paced game or anything. It's just that, yeah, once you don't have this turn limit, you also start to prioritize your stuff way more effectively, and you also start making choices like, is it even worthwhile to start moving this unit, or shall I just let him sit there and just wait for another turn? Because, well, obviously if you can shoot with a tank or an infantryman against a dug-in troop, the tank is going to be more effective. If you are able to get an extra turn in of shooting with your tank, and it's not that vital for your infantry guy to just shoot one of his shots with a very low chance of killing anything, it might be better to just pass the turn to your opponent. And then your opponent, he can also, well, obviously he's allowed to just take nearly as long as he likes to. But especially in an attacker-defender scenario, the defender normally doesn't have too much choice what you do when when you're under pressure of your of the attacker. Because if you dug in infantry, then you're normally fine in your foxholes, but once you start moving your infantry, which is the most time-consuming thing, then the next turn the tanks are totally gonna wreak havoc on them. So yeah, that balances it out quite nicely, and it's a bit of a shame that you don't have this type of mechanic in Ninth Age. But generally speaking, I would say that the game is also just built to be played during 6 turns. So if you don't manage to complete these 6 turns, then the matchups are going to shift quite tremendously. It's not really if you still play 5 turns, then it might still be kind of similar. But for example, if you're just playing against the gun line and you only get 3 turns in, then yeah, the gun line's it's probably gonna win because by that time you have just arrived at the gun line and you can just start chopping it up. But then the damage of the gun line has already been inflicted most of the times. So anyway, I hope that's a bit of a good insight for well, either experienced players that would like to go to tournaments but are afraid to do so because of some pressure, or for the newer players amongst us, or any type of slower playing players that might want to speed up the gameplay. I hope this video has been an aid to all of you, and see you the next time.